for the Iranian regime also, there are no good options, and they're dealing with multiple crises, and they're just making things worse by executing protesters. They're just generating more anger. They're trying to generate fear, instill fear, but they're actually generating more anger. And by executing a dual national, essentially a UK citizen, sort of doing the same thing, making things worse when it comes to their relations with the West, and particularly with Europe.
Now, where Rishi Sunak has condemned the execution of a British citizen in Iran, describing it as callous and cowardly. The Prime Minister said that he was appalled at the barbaric regime carrying out the death sentence on Alireza Akbari, a British Iranian citizen accused of spying for MI6 by the regime. Negar Mortazav is an Iranian journalist and a political analyst. She hosts the Iran podcast. Negar, always nice to talk to you on these issues. I wish it were under better circumstances, frankly. Where do we find ourselves?
Thanks for having me.
A real pleasure, Negar. Who was Alireza Akbari?
So Alireza Akbari held senior posts in the Islamic Republic, the top being a deputy defense minister. This is under Minister Shamkhani in the early 2000s in Iran, obviously sort of part of the close knit of the national security apparatus. But he had been a British citizen and is essentially living in the UK for the past about decade, and seems to that he would travel back to Iran, or at least did a couple of times, and once at least, as he said, at the invitation of Iranian officials, and that's when he was arrested in 2019, accused of being a spy for the UK for MI6, and then suddenly executed, as you just said the news this week.
Okay, and this has been met, understandably, hasn't it, Negar, by outrage in the United Kingdom specifically.
Definitely. We first heard outrage from UK officials, the Prime Minister, other officials in the cabinet, and also we're hearing outrage across at least the Western world. I saw the French president, Canadians, even in the US showing outrage. And the UK has also called back its ambassador in Tehran. And there seems to be other measures following this, just not simply being an outrage.
Okay. James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary here in the United Kingdom, vowed that the execution will not stand unchallenged. As we said, there are now sanctions that have been imposed. Do you feel that James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, and that the UK state have gone far enough this weekend?
Well, it's hard to say because there's a limit, or sort of a limited scope of what the US or the UK or the West can do to stop these sort of human rights abuses and the executions in Iran. So this execution comes following the execution of 4 protesters, young men, who were arrested in the course of the anti-government protests in Iran and suddenly executed in what looked like rush trials, and some international human rights organizations calling kangaroo courts. And in the case of Alireza Akbari also, he was arrested in 2019, and the family kept quiet until last week, thinking or being told that if they do keep quiet, that the case would be resolved sort of as a result of their silence. And then eventually they were told that he would have one last call or visit with his family, and is essentially being moved to the ward where people are being, or the solitary where he would be prepared for execution, and then suddenly executed in what looks like a very politically charged and politically motivated move. So there seems to be sanctions following. Iran's top prosecutor general has been sanctioned by the UK, and other sanctions may be following. There's also calls for sanctioning the entirety of the IRGC. I just don't know if that could prevent sort of similar future acts by the Iranian government, but definitely these are measures that the Western governments and the UK have as tools in their disposal.
Okay, Negar, I'd like you to respond to this, if you will. Former Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, Foreign Secretary, of course under Tony Blair, here in the United Kingdom, he spoke to Aisha Hazarika earlier on Times Radio and said this.
This is a way of them maintaining the narrative that all their problems internally in Iran are to do with venal external forces, particularly in the United States, the United Kingdom, and certain European countries. And we are supposed to be the people orchestrating all the trouble that the regime was facing.
Okay. He also went on to say the UK shouldn't, though, downgrade its diplomatic status with Iran because there is still trade and other important relations in place. Do you feel like that's a fair analysis, the right analysis from Jack Straw?
I would say I agree with both points, and I would take it even further and say it's not only them blaming sort of the protests on outside forces, but it's also the infighting of the Iranian government or the regime, the broader regime, various different factions trying to take out each other. And there's also a narrative inside Iran that this wasn't only directed at Alireza Akbari or the UK, but also his former boss, the defense minister or former defense minister Shamkhani. So this is definitely politically motivated, aimed at inside domestic forces and also outside forces, foreign forces, the West particularly. And as Mr. Straw said, I agree with him, the US and the UK essentially being top culprits in the viewpoint of the Iranians for any trouble that they have in the country.
Okay, and on the downgrading of diplomatic ties then, I mean, does that just sort of play into their narrative? Is that the argument?
Well, not only playing into the narrative, but I think having diplomatic presence on the ground is actually beneficial to the West. I understand the optics of it on essentially principle, but having diplomatic presence on the ground for Europeans over the years has been beneficial. It's given them sort of a slightly upper hand as far as understanding, having eyes and ears on the ground, understanding what's going on, and having, for example, consular visited, if it's granted. Obviously, in this case, it wasn't, but it has been cases that even the United States and now the Canadians who don't have that kind of diplomatic presence have to rely on the Europeans who do. So overall, I think it would be more of a self-inflicting pain to the Europeans, to the UK, as opposed to imposing that to the Iranian side or preventing these from happening in the future. It's a difficult situation. You know, there are no good options. I just want to make that clear. But I think the benefit of having a diplomatic presence, eyes and ears on the ground, probably outweighs cutting ties.
Okay. And just in terms of what the regime are thinking, Negar, because it strikes me that this is a move that they know will have escalated tensions between the UK and Iran. And again, that might very well be part of their plan. A relatively vulnerable regime, given everything that's been going on and the protests that have been taking place in their country. What do you see as the strategy here?
Well, you're absolutely right. They're dealing with multiple crises. The most serious legitimacy crisis or existential crisis they've faced from their own population, months of anti-government protests, protesters calling for an end to the entirety of the regime, and seriously, a very deep legitimacy crisis that goes all the way to school children. So this is not just the youth, this is not just the middle class or the working class, this is even school children that are rising up against the regime. And then obviously having this sort of tumultuous relationship with the West, with the United States. They haven't been able to complete the nuclear negotiations with Europeans. The ties are getting severed because of Iran's involvement with Russia and Ukraine. So honestly, for the Iranian regime also, there are no good options, and they're dealing with multiple crises, and they're just making things worse by executing protesters. They're just generating more anger. They're trying to generate fear, instill fear, but they're actually generating more anger. And by executing a dual national, essentially a UK citizen, sort of doing the same thing, making things worse when it comes to their relations with the West and particularly with Europe.
Okay, Negar, thank you for your time tonight. Really appreciate it. Negar Mortazav, who is an Iranian American journalist, political analyst, and the host of the Iran podcast on that story of the death sentence being handed to Alireza Akbari, a dual British-Iranian citizen accused by Iran of spying for MI6. Much more coverage of that story and insight and analysis from expert writers in your copy of The Times. TheTimes.co.uk is where you go, or times.radio/subscribe to get yourself that. On the